Welcome, everyone. I'm Liz Herkey with the Animals and Society Institute. And on behalf of myself and Carol Glasser of the American Sociological Association, welcome to the March 2024 Colloquium. Today, we're hearing from Rimona Afana, whose talk addresses how typical and atypical forms of captivity harm non-humans, how captivity has been challenged legally and civically, and how expanding our cultural and legal definitions of torture and genocide can help eradicate captivity. Now, before we jump into the program, I want to tell you a little bit about this series. This series is the brainchild of Carol Glasser, and it's a joint project between the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals and Society Institute. So if you are a sociologist, we hope that you will consider joining the ASA and, of course, joining the Animals and Society section. For those of you who are not familiar with the Animals and Society Institute, ASI is dedicated to furthering the field of human-animal studies as it concerns the complex relationship between humans and other animals. ASI has 2 managed academic journals, a book series on human-animal studies, and loads of resources for scholars, researchers, faculty, and mental health professionals on our websites. And this includes a database of HAS-related academic programs. Our HAS director, Gala Argent, produces a monthly report that is chock full of information about the field. This includes news, conferences, publications, calls for papers, job opportunities, and grant funding. And we'll put the links for all of these resources in the chat for you. Now, we encourage everyone, non-academics or academics of any discipline, to sign up for the HAS newsletter. It's really a valuable resource, and we hope that you'll check it out along with the other resources on the website. So on to today's talk. Now, as a reminder, Carol will be monitoring the chat if you prefer to ask your question that way, and we will hold off on all questions until after the talk. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. Rimona, who prefers to be addressed as Rimona, is a Romanian Palestinian independent researcher, lecturer, activist, and multimedia artist. Rimona works on environmental harms, non-human rights, violent conflicts, state crimes, and colonial legacies. Rimona is a convener of the Ecocide Speciesism Symposium and regional co-director at the World Moot on International Law and Animal Rights. Formerly an assistant professor of peace studies at Kennesaw State University and a visiting scholar at the Emory University School of Law, Rimona has published multiple articles, chapters, and creative works, and has been involved in many civic projects on human and non-human rights. Rimona, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone, please join us in welcoming Rimona.
Thank you so much, Liz. Do you all hear me well? Okay. So thanking everyone so much for joining me today, and thanking my hosts, Carol, Liz, and Lisa at the Animals and Society Institute. I'll be sharing my recent research on challenging animal captivity, which will be a chapter in the upcoming Routledge Handbook on Wildlife Crime. This is work in progress. It's the first time I think of this topic, so I much appreciate any feedback. This presentation only covers some of the main findings. If you're keen on reading my entire paper, I'd gladly send it to you. Do reach out by email or social media. I've left my contact details in the chat box. Today I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to follow my notes. I'll be covering first how captivity harms animals, second how captivity has been challenged legally and civically, and third how captivity could be redefined and criminalized. First, a bit on the motivations, forms, and effects of animal captivity. Billions of non-human animals today live and die in captivity. Across sectors like food, clothing, medicine, or entertainment, the torture and murder of animals relies on their confinement. Criminal yet legal sectors such as industrial animal farming or wildlife trade source their profits in the captivity, exploitation, and killing of animals. Driving our crimes against non-human animals is, of course, their commodification. As long as animals are designated as property, trading them, and everything incurred by trade, from confinement to torture and killing, remains a legal normalized anomaly. Sentient beings suffer physically and psychologically from captivity. Their need for freedom, for autonomy, and for bodily integrity collides with our so-called right to abuse them, cemented by their legal designation as property. Abducted from their habitats, wild animals are confined in small cages. They can spend weeks in transport without proper food, water, adequate temperatures, ventilation, lacking the ability to move, which creates intense physical and psychological stress. Once they reach their beneficiaries, whether it's laboratories, zoos, aquariums, circuses, private animal collectors, meat, fur, or leather processing facilities, so-called alternative medicine practitioners, taxidermists, and so on, animals continue life for months, years, or decades in captivity. Or they are killed for their bodies to be used, or they die from illness, often a direct cause of the trauma caused by abduction and confinement. Wild animals, whether they are freeborn and abducted from the wild or bred in captivity, may be worse impacted by captivity because, unlike domesticated animals who've adapted over the course of generations, wild animals are not physically and psychologically used to being confined and to forced interaction with humans. Many of us probably recall animals at the zoo pacing left and right with a vacant stare in their eyes. Stereotypies are obsessive-compulsive behaviors associated with confinement, such as pacing, swaying, circling, jumping, over-grooming, biting the bars of the enclosure or cage, or aggression towards other animals, towards humans, or even towards self. Stereotypic behavior becomes prevalent in captivity, attesting the intense stress of confinement. Also, many social animals are held captive alone for years or decades. When it comes to humans, solitary confinement causes or exacerbates mental illness and is recognized as a form of torture by many lawyers, psychiatrists, and activists. Humans and many sentient non-human animals have similar needs, and they suffer similarly from the privation of those needs. A neuroscientist, Laurie Marino, documents that for whales, captivity produces chronic stress, which leads to immune system dysfunction, causing illness and premature death. Captive whales routinely die from opportunistic infections and suffer from behavioral disorders indicative of brain damage. Sometimes traumas are also passed on intergenerationally. One example is Hugo, an orca captive at the Miami Aquarium who died in 1980 of a brain aneurysm after repeatedly bashing his head against the tank's walls. Another example is Tilikum, an orca held captive for over 3 decades, mostly at the SeaWorld Marine Entertainment Park in Orlando, Florida. Tilikum killed 3 of his trainers in separate incidents over the years. These attest the severe psychological and physical implications of captivity, particularly for mammals with complex cognition and social ties. We see that just as in humans, compromised mental health can lead to homicide and suicide, in intelligent non-humans, the effects of captivity can also cause the killing of others or killing of self. Rather than an anomaly, such acts can be considered a normal form of resistance to captivity exhibited by many animals. And the fascinating resource here is a book by Jason Hribal called The Hidden History of Animal Resistance. Studies have shown that captivity harms physically and psychologically a variety of species whose sentience is fairly well understood. For instance, when it comes to captive chimpanzees, they also exhibit serious behavioral abnormalities indicative of compromised mental health, such as hitting or biting themselves, eating feces, grooming stereotypically, regurgitating, plucking hair, according to a study by Burgett and Newton Fisher. Farmed animals also experience horrific forms of captivity, kept in cages or crates, sometimes so small that they can't even turn around. The stress of overpopulated, tight enclosures causes mental illness and many severe injuries and illnesses. Also, animals are so excessively grown to produce more profit that their bones and joints often cannot bear the weight of their bodies. They end up not just captive in cages, but captive in their own bodies. For both wild and domesticated animals, captivity is typically tied to some form of torture, although I believe captivity itself can be considered a form of torture. And captivity is typically the precursor of direct or indirect killing. So these animals live and die in pain and fear. While conventional forms of captivity are commonly known and condemned, we also have atypical forms, or forms which are not typically seen as unethical. So for me, gray areas remain on what constitutes captivity and whether all forms of captivity are harmful. For instance, is small-scale subsistence farming also keeping animals captive? Are rescued animals placed in shelters and sanctuaries also experiencing captivity? Are companion animals, domestic and wild, kept for life inside homes, also captive? Understanding that the captivity of humans and non-humans has similar motivations, manifestations, and consequences might create interspecies compassion and solidarity. Given my prior work on war crimes and crimes against humanity, I see non-human captivity similar in forms and effects to human captivity. Though states and corporations profit differently from trapping their victims, humans and sentient non-humans suffer similarly from captivity. A few examples from slavery in ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, or the European colonization in the Americas. Humans once enslaved, just like non-human animals now still enslaved, experienced captivity, forced labor, torture, and murder. Another example is Syria's Sinai military prison, where thousands of dissidents have been imprisoned, tortured, and massacred. Testimonies of survivors and of prison officials and physicians produced by Amnesty International attest to horrific practices tied to captivity, such as privation of basic needs like water, food, light, and movement, untreated acute and chronic illnesses, severe torture, such as beatings, burning, electrocution, broken bones, and brutal killings, typically mass hangings. Captivity makes life unlivable for prisoners of conscience, prisoners of war, and other individuals persecuted by states through a range of sinister methods, crushing their body and spirit. Another form of captivity is the genocide of Yazidis in Iraq by ISIS, which included keeping thousands of Yazidi women and girls captive for years as sexual or domestic slaves. One other form of captivity, perhaps atypical, is the Gaza Strip, where half of my relatives live, often described as the world's largest open-air prison. Palestinians there are held captive and terrorized through Israel's now 17-year-old land, air, and naval blockade, which blocks or severely limits people and goods from entering or exiting the besieged strip. Combined with routine bombings, which cause constant death, maiming, psychological trauma, and displacement, they ruin vital infrastructure and have destroyed the economy. Most Gazans live in poverty and lack access to basic resources like clean water, nutritious and sufficient food, electricity, and adequate medical care. Following Hamas's carnage against Israelis since mid-October last year, captivity has been weaponized amid Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. Israel has reduced to rubble the entire strip, massacring almost 33,000 people, 70% of them children and women, injuring and maiming around 100,000 people and displacing 2 million. That is almost the entire population of Gaza. People have nowhere to run to, so they remain captive. Besides those unjustly held captive, like Syrians, Yazidis, Palestinians, and many others, even those legally imprisoned fall victim to what in the US has been described as the prison industrial complex, which profits immensely from captivity. As all of these illustrations show, the captivity of both humans and non-humans is often a form of a state or corporate crime. Those states and corporations profit differently from trapping their victims. For both humans and non-humans, captivity is part of a continuum of torturous practices used as a tool for maximizing political or economic power. This introduction hopefully makes a case for why many forms of human and non-human captivity are non-criminalized crimes which need to be challenged. Captivity has been contested through direct action, litigation, legislative initiatives, advocacy, research, teaching, artwork, and so on. Next, I discuss some legal and civic initiatives seeking to free captive animals. So over the past decade, animal rights lawyers have invoked the writ of habeas corpus to free captive animals. Habeas corpus is a legal recourse protecting persons from unlawful and indefinite detention. Taking this approach when it comes to non-humans relies on two conceptual extensions. First, considering animals to be persons, which they are not. Animals remain property in all jurisdictions, although many countries have recognized non-human sentience. And two, qualifying their confinement across various commercial sectors as a form of unlawful detention, which has been mostly rejected by courts. In 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project filed the world's first habeas corpus case involving non-human animals on behalf of Hercules and Leo, chimpanzees held captive in a lab in Louisiana. The court ruled that as non-persons, the two chimpanzees could not legally challenge their captivity. In 2018, the Non-Human Rights Project filed another habeas corpus petition to free Happy, an elephant held captive for the past 45 years at the Bronx Zoo, in recent years confined alone. As with the prior case in 2022, the court ruled that habeas corpus only covers human beings. Specifically, the Supreme Court dismissed the petition affirming the writ of habeas corpus is limited to humans, and that decisions on whether or how to integrate other species in legal frameworks designed for humans is, quote, better suited for the legislative process. However, legislative approaches to challenging captivity remain rare and narrow. One example is Proposition 12, also known as the Farm Animal Confinement Initiative, a 2018 ballot proposition in California supported by over 62% of voters. Prop 12 introduced new standards for the confinement of hens, pigs, and cows, obliging farmers to ensure more space for animals. For instance, pigs must be raised within at least 24 square feet per animal. This effectively bans gestation crates, which are tiny crates in which pregnant sows are trapped for nearly their entire life, a cruel practice common in the pork industry. In a recent lawsuit filed by the pork industry against these new standards, the US Supreme Court upheld Prop 12. Supposedly a win for animals, this ruling, however, doesn't challenge the legality of captivity, torture, and murder of animals. Returning to the Non-Human Rights Project case to free Happy in 2022, the State of New York Court of Appeals ruled that the writ of habeas corpus only covers human beings and does not apply to Happy, deemed to not be a person subjected to illegal detention. The court also noted, quote, that granting such rights to elephants and animals generally would have an enormous destabilizing impact on modern society, end quote, given the potential ramifications of such ruling for sectors reliant on the use of animals. This, we see, reinforces the role of courts in defending corporate interests and normalizing anomalies across a variety of issues harming humans and non-humans. In June last year, the Non-Human Rights Project filed another habeas corpus petition on behalf of 5 African elephants confined for decades at a zoo in Colorado Springs. The petition insists that the elephants are deprived of, quote, their ability to meaningfully exercise their autonomy and extraordinary cognitive complexity, including the freedom to choose where to go, what to do, and with whom to be. This approach centered on capacities or sentience. Notice above the emphasis on, quote, their extraordinary cognitive complexity. This is a common approach in legal, civic, and scholarly work seeking to advance animal rights. While it's meant to counter the anthropocentrism and speciesism prevalent in most cultures, it is itself speciesist because it portrays rights as flowing from special capacities. This notion would, of course, feel unethical if we applied it to humans, because it could be used to exclude the disabled, the elderly, babies, and other groups. When it comes to non-human animals, it is problematic because it narrows the scope of animal rights to certain species considered advanced in terms of needs and abilities. Significantly, it also tends to privilege those needs and capacities similar to those of humans. Another example of illegal efforts to free captive animals is Tokite, a southern resident orca violently separated from her family in the Salish Sea, confined alone in a tiny tank at the Miami Sea Aquarium for the past 53 years, and forced to perform daily. Prior legal efforts framed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act and the Animal Welfare Act failed to secure her release, but a new case was opened in 2019 by the Earth Law Center and their partners. The new legal argument for releasing Tokite was framed under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a U.S. federal law mandating the return to Native Americans the remains of their ancestors and objects of cultural patrimony. Tokite was presented as a relative of the Lami people who needs to be returned to her home and to her indigenous relatives. In March last year, the Aquarium agreed Toki would be returned to the Salish Sea, but in August, Toki died, still in captivity. After her death, scientists and activists reiterated the call for an immediate permanent worldwide ban on cetacean captivity. Another case seeking the release of captive orcas is Tillicum versus SeaWorld, brought in 2011 by PETA on behalf of Tillicum and 4 other orcas. Tillicum had spent over 30 years in captivity, and PETA argued that the orca's captivity amounts to slavery and involuntary servitude, and therefore that the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution applies here. As in many other non-human rights cases, the court held that the 13th Amendment only applies to humans. These legal cases to free captive animals rely on a strategic engagement with laws which typically exclude non-humans. But since animals remain property in all jurisdictions, securing rights associated to legal personhood remains rare. I will move now to civic challenges to captivity. So animal captivity has also been challenged civically through open and clandestine rescue, occupations, protests, advocacy, petitions, and awareness raising on social media. Open and clandestine rescue have been practiced for decades by activists, and since rescuers often end up on trial, these civic challenges to captivity involve a legal component too. Open rescue is a form of direct action through which animals are extracted from sites causing them suffering. They are offered adequate shelter and food, veterinary treatment, rehabilitation, and are ultimately placed in shelters or sanctuaries, adopted in private homes, or released when it comes to wild animals. Unlike clandestine rescue, where activists hide their identities, in open rescue, the identities of rescuers are public. Open rescue is typically non-violent, but it may involve property damage, which some activists for human and non-human rights consider to be a necessary part of challenging state and corporate crimes. Some examples: Animal Liberation Front activists have engaged in mostly clandestine rescue. Among their most notable actions is the release of about 10,000 mink from a fur factory in Salton, Washington. Most mink were soon recaptured by farm staff. Because ALF members have also committed property crime, U.S. Homeland Security and the FBI have listed the organization as a domestic terrorist threat. Also involved in direct action for animals is UK-based Animal Rising, formerly known as Animal Rebellion. Their work includes open animal rescue and farm occupations, mass trespass at animal racing events, and public-facing disruptions such as roadblock sit-ins at restaurants or supermarkets, and so on. In 2022, Wayne and Paul, investigators with Direct Action Everywhere, were unanimously acquitted by a jury in Utah of theft and burglary charges for which they risked up to 10 years in prison after rescuing 2 ill piglets captive at Smithfield Farms, which is the largest pork producer in the US, and exposing the crimes and lies of industrial animal farming. Last spring, other 2 members of Direct Action Everywhere were acquitted by a jury in California of theft charges after rescuing 2 sick chickens from a truck heading to a slaughterhouse owned by Foster Farms, one of the largest poultry producers in the US. Legal scholars and practitioners have presented such cases of voluntary prosecution tied to open rescue, not as an aberration, but as a tool for pushing legal and social change. And these acquittals have set significant precedents for the right to rescue animals held captive by criminal sectors like industrial animal farming and wildlife trade. Another recent development on challenging captivity is the Reed Glen Farms beagle rescue case. This month, 10 days before the trial was about to begin, the state of Wisconsin dropped all charges against 3 Direct Action Everywhere activists who in 2017 broke into the farm, which is one of the largest dog breeders for experimentation in the US, and rescued 3 beagles. The case was dismissed at the request of Ridgeland Farms, who claimed the concern for their physical safety and for their business. And I would say that just like in the Smithfield trial, this one also risked exposing the systematic abuse rampant in the facility, which is probably why Ridgeland Farms chose to not move forward. Direct Action Everywhere and many other organizations are involved in other rescue cases and are leading campaigns to establish legally the so-called right to rescue. We see that resisting violence requires courageous actions like infiltrating, exposing, and destabilizing criminal industries. And though courts typically protect the interests of states and companies, there are also cases where courts embrace a critical approach to violence and to civil resistance. In my paper, I discuss several parallels between anti-war and human rights activism and animal rights activism, attesting similar strategies used to confront crimes by states and corporations. To conclude, we live amid times of unprecedented animal abuse and environmental destruction, but these are also times of unprecedented activism. People's minds and hearts are changing about the rights of animals and about our duties towards them. Resisting animal captivity is one form of nonviolence we all need to contribute to, because non-criminalized criminality remains, unfortunately, the norm in our treatment of non-humans today. Sectors like industrial animal farming and wildlife trade victimize trillions of animals every year. As I've shown in my prior research, these criminal industries should be treated as a continuum between a genocide and ecocide, not as normal, necessary, and legal economies. Current laws allow these crimes. While genocide still holds the title of crime of all crimes, yet resting on a narrow notion of annihilation, which excludes non-humans, ongoing genocides remain non-criminalized. Another legal category applicable to the harms inflicted on non-human animals is torture. Here again, we see the law denying sentient non-humans the protections they should enjoy. The UN Convention Against Torture, of course, excludes animals, and animal welfare laws only cover a limited portion of what constitutes torture. I look at captivity itself as a form of torture, and at the same time, as discussed previously, captivity is typically tied to other forms of torture. By expanding our cultural and legal definitions of genocide and torture to include non-human animals, captivity and its adjacent crimes might be hopefully eradicated one day. And this can be reached by legal and civic efforts to recognize that non-human captivity is tied to torture and genocide, which are criminalized and rooted in the public consciousness as unacceptable. This ethical leap to include non-humans in laws dedicated to humans is, of course, a slow process, but not impossible given the many similarities between the suffering of captive humans and captive non-humans, and also given the parallels between activism against crimes affecting humans and those victimizing non-humans. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. I've left my contact details in the chat box. I'd also like to invite all of you to attend 3 panels on animal captivity I'm organizing in April or May. They are part of a symposium on environmental crimes and non-human rights I've been convening independently for the past 3 years. I'm also welcoming everyone here to present their work at my symposium, because besides these specific panels on captivity, I'm also organizing a new general panels on environmental harms. So please find in the chat box details on the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Now we'd like to open it up for audience questions. So you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or you can just use the hand raise. There's a lot of people, so I might not see you if you make a signal, but if you use the hand raised reaction, you'll float to the top of my screen and I'll be able to call on you. So do we have any initial questions? To get us started, this isn't necessarily about the content of what you just said, but you noted a number of times comparison to your right and human rights work. I'm interested in how you, I think you're probably doing some of it simultaneously, but how you transition from the work you were doing in human rights to bridging it to non-human animals. Was there like a moment that happened or a case that came up that really stuck out to you?
I'm not sure how to deliver a short answer, but I guess the epiphany was about my own hypocrisy, about I guess it's so normal to prioritize a certain section of rights or needs, uh, which are normal to you, while excluding many other beings. So I worked for almost 15 years on human rights, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Um, I had already been a vegan for 10 years now, but it still hadn't dawned on me that there's this continuum between crimes against humans and crimes against non-humans. So I guess the point for me was, after finishing my PhD, which was about crimes in Israel, Palestine, I had become in a way so fed up with all that I felt the need for something new. Now, of course, I still work on both. I still work on crimes in Palestine, as well as environmental crimes and crimes against non-humans. But yeah, I guess in short is just having that epiphany that you cannot be morally consistent if you only respect the rights of a certain class of beings while participating in crimes and other types of violations against other beings.
Thank you so much for explaining that. We have a question in the audience. Joanne, I see that you put it in the chat, but if you're comfortable asking your question, you can go ahead and unmute and ask it.
Certainly. First, thank you so much. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. Thank you for your anti-speciesist language. Thank you for your work. I have been a vegan for 51 years. And I love what I'm seeing in society today. It gives me hope that one day before I die, the world will be more vegan than it was when I was born. Having said that, we do at the Sella Care Farm, we do rescue farm animals, and we rescue them from abuse, from slaughter, from homelessness, a lot of torture situations. And I'm wondering how you mentioned that in terms of the ethics of captivity. I'm wondering if you can talk me through how we resolve that, right?
Thank you so much, Joanne, for your comment and your question. To be honest, it's an area I haven't really looked into in my paper. It's still an area I'm trying to understand, but I think when thinking of captivity, this was probably one of the first things that came into my mind. What about well-meaning captivity? We all think we are animal lovers, but at the same time, at some point in our life, we all subjected an animal, a non-human animal we loved, to captivity, whether in our home, whether we grew up in a village at a farm like I did. So you see captivity everywhere, but it's so normalized. We don't interrogate it. Of course, later on volunteering with animal shelters, I witnessed other forms of captivity. For instance, I guess it's this trade-off between saving as many animals as you can and then the very limited resources you have, which practically ends up in just cramming a lot of animals in an extremely tight space, which I have seen to produce intense physical and psychological stress for animals. And I'm sure you can share much more than me because you're working on that every day. So it's not an area I've figured out yet, but I'm just asking myself every day, how do we resolve this paradox between saving animals and, I guess, subjecting them to other forms of abuse, I guess milder compared to the abuse they were saved from, but at the same time, not negligible. So I would love to hear more from you.
Well, first, thank you so much. One of the things that I'm hearing you say is that sometimes good intentions end up hurting animals as well. And so I think it's a conundrum for me, honestly. We have 50 animals. There are many more I would love to save, but we have 20 acres. And so we have plenty of space, and no one is is confined, but they're certainly not free. But they wouldn't survive if they were just set free either, because they were in captivity and they don't know how to be free animals. And this is the conundrum for us. You know, I would love for there to be a time when there was no need for any sanctuary. But what I think I'm hearing you say is that there's a continuum of in ethics as it relates to, quote, rescuing animals. There's a continuum of potential harm versus the potential alleviation of suffering, or, quote, rescuing. Is that right? Am I hearing that right?
I guess for me, especially when it comes to companion animals, my question is, do the benefits of captivity, which include, of course, avoiding hunger and thirst, avoiding untreated illness and accidents, avoiding exposure to predators and to extreme weather conditions, which wild and stray animals typically experience, do they outweigh the negatives, which include stress and anxiety caused by insufficient physical movement, by lacking of vast and stimulating environment, caused also by a lacking companionship of individuals of their own species, or being forced daily to experience stressful companionship with humans? How do we evaluate that, and how can we even like treat our answers as correct as long as we cannot have the animal's perspective? And I would assume the same questions apply when it comes to rescued animals, domestic and wild, uh, who have to be kept in captivity in a shelter, sanctuary, or so on.
Right. So the more natural conditions, if we're going with the idea of ethics on a continuum, the more natural the conditions and the better care they get, the more access to their natural environment they have, and the less coercion used, with the exception of medical care when necessary, the better.
I would assume so, and I guess it also depends a lot on where we come from, because of course we know some countries are richer than others. So there's more of a civic culture around animal rights in certain countries as opposed to others. So where I am now, Romania, there's very limited funding for animal rescue organizations. So animals typically end up rescued, but in conditions I would classify as a form of torture. Their confinement is, the conditions are like really bad in most shelters, again, because of lack of resources. So it's kind of heartbreaking to know that you save them from an abusive human, and at the same time, like you're keeping them trapped in very tight spaces, and like the stress that produces. Public shelters are, of course, much, much worse. It's like a concentration camp. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Thank you. We have a couple comments in the chat. Does anyone have a direct question before I turn to these comments? Mary, Marby directs us to two other authors. I don't know if you want to talk about either of these topics, but Marby points out David Nybert's work that asserting that animal liberation can't happen without liberation from capitalism, and Corey Rin's work on the relationship between patriarchy, feminism, and how those are tied into speciesism. So if you have any comments on either of those topics, please let us know. Otherwise, I'll go on to some other comments.
Well, just thank you for these resources. I've just copied them, and we'll definitely look into these books or videos. So thank you so much.
And then I think maybe one of the comments is deleted. We do have a practical comment. Someone wants to know how we can know about when your symposium is. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry. I'm in the planning stages of these 3 panels on challenging captivity I'm organizing, and I will announce them on my social media. You have all the details there, and also on the symposium page, but most probably they will be sometime after mid-April or May, and there will be a debate panel. I have a bunch of animal rights experts who agreed to join um, as panelists, and then there will also be 2 presentations panels with scholars and practitioners talking about different aspects of captivity. And I'm welcoming everyone. And when it comes to the general symposium panels, those will probably be from May on, every 2 months or so. And I'm definitely welcoming new presenters. So you can find all details in the symposium booklet I linked and on the symposium page.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions about Rimona's talk today in the audience?
Also sorry to interject, about David Nibert's work on animal liberation and capitalism. I'm not familiar with his work, but of course it's I think it's a sentiment held by most animal rights and human rights activists that oppression is in many ways tied to capitalism. But at the same time, we need to also be honest and remember that in non-capitalist or pre-capitalist society, many forms of animal abuse have been and still are normalized. So I wouldn't romanticize so much non-capitalist paradigms, because again, like growing up in a village in Romania, my grandparents lived under communism for all their lives, and I've seen many forms of animal abuse which were totally normal in the village. So of course, not the scale of industrial animal farming, for instance. So the scale definitely matters, but I think animal exploitation and abuse are normalized in many economic and political paradigms.
That's a great point. We have a comment that about the difference between, welfare-based approaches and rights-based approaches, with the question, how can we move from the welfare approach to a rights-based approach when thinking about non-human animals? Oh, you're on mute again.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. I'm thanking my sister Azadeh for joining and for asking this question. I wish I had the answer. Unfortunately, all countries globally are rooted in the welfarist approach, and we are probably generations away from an animal rights paradigm, but we are slowly moving in that direction, and all the wins for animal rights in recent years attest that we are definitely moving in that direction. I don't think animals will become legal persons anytime soon, but we can definitely enhance legal rights for animals, while unfortunately still being stuck in the property paradigm.
I have a question. I noticed in your talk that you talked about a lot of different countries, and it sounds like you have pretty deep knowledge of the landscape, particularly legally, of a number of different countries. So I'm wondering how you see the challenge. I mean, I know you just said that you don't really see personhood getting recognized legally anytime soon, but do you think that this challenge should be met like in a global way, or that there's certain inroads in certain specific national contexts where this work should be started?
I'm not sure. Many countries in recent years have recognized animal sentience. That's a step forward, but at the same time, animals remain property in all jurisdictions. And because, again, of capitalism, because taking animals outside the property paradigm would basically like endanger or even annihilate many extremely profitable industries. And because we all know such industries have an immense impact on government and the legislative process, I think there are dim chances of animals gaining the rights they need and deserve within our lifetime, at least. But we are slowly moving there, and the rights of nature movement has advanced non-human rights, not only when it comes to sentient non-humans, but other parts of nature, like entire ecosystems. Of course, there's also a bit of a tension there between the rights of movement and animal rights, because theoretically the rights of movement, like giving legal personhood to parts of nature, like ecosystems, would theoretically benefit non-human animals, but still, even in the rights of nature movement, just like in environmental law in general, the focus is on species conservation, not on individual animal rights. So when you look at many environmental law treaties, and actually this is the last paper I wrote in January about this tension between species, the focus on species and the respect for the individual in environmental law. What we see in most environmental law treaties is that the focus is exclusively on species. So individuals of that species are killable if the species is not vulnerable in any way. And that's a normalized part of environmental law. And I don't know how we could ever change that, because again, it's a very complex intellectual, ethical, legal, and practical endeavor to respect the rights of individual animals, to see their intrinsic value, to see them as capable of suffering and deserving of rights, instead of this cosmetic approach focused on species.
Thank you. That is, as Liz just said in the comments, that's really a lot to unpack and a lot to think about. I think your talk has us all thinking a lot about a lot of important issues. Liz has a question on a more personal level. Do you have a philosophy or advice for maintaining relationships with people who see themselves as empathetic, moral, or good, but they're still unfazed by the use of animals in their day-to-day lives, especially around the social construction of animals as food, while they're still professing a stance against torture and abuse?
I'm not sure what to start with, because it's of course been at the center of my life, a source of conflict in my closest relationship, from life partnerships to family dynamics. So I don't think I have an answer to that, and I'm not sure if more information is the answer, actually. Paradoxically, when you present people with the relevant data, sometimes that generates even more resistance to empathy when it comes to like just generalizing the empathy. So I think perhaps subjecting people to strong emotional experiences is more effective than feeding them more information. And I don't know how that can be done with their consent. I mean, you cannot abduct your brother and take him to a slaughterhouse so he can actually like feel the horrors ongoing there. But I'm not sure. There are many documentaries these days which people can take a look at, and perhaps it just changes something within them. Because again, I think it's an emotional process, not an intellectual process. I think you can know a lot and still be on the wrong side of history, so to say. And it takes an epiphany, and it cannot be strategized or scheduled. We have it or don't have it. We have it sooner or we have it later. I'm 39 now. I only became vegan at 28, and I thought I was a compassionate person, of course, for all of my life, but it still took me 28 years to realize that I cannot claim to be ethical and moral if I'm not intellectually and practically respecting the rights of others. And I can't say I am, because all of us are complicit in so many industries. which are contributing to animal abuse. So of course, being vegan is just a tiny slice of the cake. No matter how ethical we want to be, we still remain complicit because so much of modern life is just tied, inextricably tied to horrors against animals. So I don't know what the answer is.
Thank you. We have two questions that I see, so I'll just take them in the order that I saw them. The first is in the chat. The question comes from Deborah and says, could you speak more about the tension between animal rights activism as a way to portray a nation state or culture as more humane than another that does not put animal rights on the agenda as much? I'm specifically thinking about the Israel-Palestine context where animal discourse is channeled to the point of the inhumaneness of Palestinians versus Israel as vegan capital of the world.
Thank you. If you can allow me a few seconds to read it again to properly understand it. I'm not sure if my thoughts are necessarily relevant to the question, but I'm thinking that, for instance, Israel, as far as I know, is the vegan capital of the world. Per capita, there are more vegans or vegetarians than anywhere else in the world, at least according to the last statistics I looked at. So that sounds like a pretty moral country until you, of course, look at what's being done to Palestinians and many other segments of like just regular affairs in Israeli society. So about the dehumanization of Palestinians, yes, it's been ongoing for 100 years. I could also say, if I have to be honest, that it's occurred the other way around also. Israelis are also dehumanized by many Palestinians. The only difference is that the Israelis have the military means to obliterate and to oppress in many other ways Palestinians, but Palestinians do not have that. But when it comes to dehumanization, I've seen pretty grim examples on both sides.
Thank you. We have one question from Joanne.
I also don't want to take up all the time. So if someone else has a question, I'll let them jump in.
I think you're the only one right now with a question, and we're coming to the end. So this might be a great question to start wrapping up with too.
Okay, all right. I wanted to respond to something that you said about reaching people emotionally instead of through proselytization, right? And I think that that's a really important point. And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about a study that we conducted here at the Cella Care Farm, because we are a sanctuary, but we also bring people in to help us take care of the animals when we rescue them. And they're all people who have experienced traumatic grief. So they're very vulnerable and they're very wounded. And one of the things that surprised me in one of the outtakes surveys that we found in the qualitative data was that almost 25% of people who left here and stopped eating animals and stopped eating animal products. And I did not expect to see that, but these were people who were interviewed 1 to 3 months after their stay. So and a lot of the feedback was that they were really broken open by this huge human animal loss that they experienced. And they were in a really vulnerable emotional place to see the suffering of the other, understanding that there is really no other, capital O, other. And that their woundedness helped them be more sensitive to the wounding of animals. One of the sheep we rescued who had her baby stolen from her at birth, and a mother whose baby died connects with this sheep. And it's profound to see. And people start to see animals in their personalities. And when they're liberated, they can be free from human coercion and free to be who they are. And I think what you said is very important, because I think emotions are central to that experience. When people have their own emotional experience with animals and they see non-human animals, and they see the non-human animal as a being who knows fear, who knows terror, who knows loss, who knows loneliness, who knows grief, who loves their babies just like we love our babies, it can be a transformative experience.
Thank you so much for this example. And I think digital skills are very important when it comes to conveying this. And I see a lot of organizations doing great work, animal shelters and so on, but they don't have the resources to get a good like social media officer or like a good videographer. And a lot of these very precious moments are lost because they are just not out there. So they don't exist. Unfortunately, we can only absorb what's conveyed through social media these days. So it's very important for animal rescue organizations and other types of animal rights to have effective media which somehow touches people. And I can also think of other types of advocacy work and educational work, like for instance, the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. I'm not sure if that's the correct title, but something along those lines. An organization set up by psychologist Melanie Joy, who introduced the concept carnism. There are a lot of useful resources there for effective vegan advocacy. And also one of their last courses, if I remember well, was on confronting our own privileges as vegans, something not typically discussed.
Thank you. So we only have 2 minutes left. I don't know if there's any last words you'd like to get in before we close out, Rimona.
Not really. I'm just looking at the chat box and copying some of the comments and resources because they're very useful. And I'd love to be in touch with all of you. I left my contact details, so please add me on social media or email me. And I hope to see many of you at these panels on challenging captivity and just at other events in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rimona, for this wonderful talk. I will keep this room open for just another minute or two in case anyone wants to grab anything off of the chat. But other than that, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. If you are on the ASI email list, or if when you signed up for this talk, you click that you would like to know about future talks, we will be in touch with you soon. We plan to have a panel on teaching human animal studies classes later in April, and we'll have one more talk in May before we take a short break for the summer. So thank you everybody for your time today, and be looking for an email from me with a recording of this event so that you can share it with other people who will benefit from this wonderful talk. Have a good day, everyone.